I was working as a journalist abroad down in Mexico in a very interesting situation in Sierra Madre, where there was a native group who were really under assault by logging companies and drug lords. And while I was there chronicling what was happening to them, I get a letter from my uncle in Kentucky saying, hey, the same thing has happened here. You know, while you're abroad, coal companies from the outside, in this instance it was local coal companies eventually leased out to one of the worst mountaintop removal offenders from eastern Kentucky. They came in and strip mined our ancestral property, our homeland, where our last cousin was the last holdout in our holler of Eagle Creek. And so literally in an instant, 200 years of our history was completely eliminated and strip mined and destroyed. You know, my family is from the southeastern corner of southern Illinois, just 15 minutes from Kentucky. And in fact, we're 330 miles away from Chicago and just 2 whoops and a holler, of course, from Memphis and then down in the Alabama hills. And so definitely the culture was definitely more akin to the Ozarks and Appalachia than it was in the rest of the state. I mean, we actually discovered coal in Illinois, not in Appalachia. It's the French who actually came in the 1600s and found this black rock among the Shawnee and off the Illinois River. And the French, in fact, took back 4 Shawnee and a crate load of coal, and that changed the whole face of America, because they came back within a very few years with 500 African slaves and began the coal industry. And what we eventually found out was the villainization, the criminalization of the natives in order to remove them came around and hit us as well. That already by the 1840s and the 1850s, there was a discussion by suddenly new immigrants coming in from the industrial areas of England saying, we need to get rid of these backwoods hillbillies because they're basically sitting on rich areas. And there already was a discussion of removal a century ago. And that was more or less launched by a removal of Native Americans, but that still today, of course, we see with mountaintop removal, that the largest forced removal of American citizens is still taking place in the coal fields. Strip mining started, commercial strip mining in southeastern Illinois in the 1850s, Bob. They brought in their horses and scrapers and the plows because the outcroppings were so high and began to tear away at our hills. And then they brought in those steam power engines. You know, the same thing that dug out the Panama Canal, they brought those same kind of steam power shovels and started digging out and leaving pits in our land.
The Mammoth Bucyrus, right.
Exactly. And then, of course, we graduated to the walking drag lines, you know, these 21 stories tall, the tallest building in the county, you know, and they began to scoop up 2 seams of coal at the same time and leave behind meteor craters. And now, of course, they simply use ammonium nitrate fuel explosives to blow up the mountains in Appalachia or blow up the hills. They were using ANFO and Eagle Creek as well, and didn't use bulldozers and heavy equipment operators to finish the task. Well, it's this is sort of what Appalachia is going to look like in 50 years, because here's this pockmarked region that never was really considered. You know, so much of our strip mining happened before SMACRA, the Surface Mining Reclamation Control Act. And so you have just miles and miles of wasteland that now it gives a very haunting atmosphere, you know, because it's sort of unmanaged grasslands and brush and whatnot. And of course, they've made attempts at reclamation in the last 30 years, but it's pitiful, as you know. You know, less than 2% of our land in southern Illinois, just like Appalachia, has ever been returned to any kind of productive economic activity after it's been strip mined. But even worse, because of the unique diversity of our forests where we are, they've never been able to replant and recreate the forest, of course, that they've destroyed. That just like in Appalachia with mountaintop removal, the damage is irreversible. The Eagle Creek itself is completely sterile now. We used to go fish as children, and it was famous, of course, for the springs. And now today, Bob, because of the discharges that were allowed legally into the stream, not only is the Saline River completely polluted, and Saline, of course, gives Saline County its name, but Eagle Creek is completely sterile and destroyed, that hundreds of miles of our streams have been ruined because of discharges from the abandoned mines. We have so many underground mines in the area as well. And the streams have all dried up. You know, and part of the joke, of course, is that Eagle Creek had the same sort of backwoods, moonshining, gun-toting hillbilly culture that you have in Appalachia. And I'll never forget my grandfather explaining to me that moonshine was an indicator of the environmental health of the region. And listen to me for just a second on this one. Moonshine needs two things. It needs clean water, clean spring water, and it needs hardwoods to fire up the still. And when we lost that last moonshiner in Eagle Creek was famous for its moonshine, it's because they had killed the waters and they completely deforested the region of our hardwoods. We have purposely sort of criminalized and marginalized rural cultures, woodland cultures, that ultimately were sustainable, that ultimately had a connection to the land. That people chose to live up in the hills of southern Illinois for a reason, because historically down in the lowlands and the swampy areas down by the river, there was a tremendous amount of disease, and that they're able to bring the woodland culture of Appalachia into the woodland culture of southern Illinois. And it's not to romanticize the woodland culture. I mean, eventually everybody had to find jobs beyond farming and beyond hunting. But the idea was that there was a connection, that we did live off the land. But what happened ultimately to this area was that it had kept out any kind of diversification or sustainable economy, and that virtually by 1905, all the mineral rights of the region had been bought up by Chicago and outside interests. So the colonies, the region itself served as some sort of vassal colony for the whims of outside markets. Southern Illinois, much like many counties in West Virginia, are completely owned by outsiders, and therefore they put a complete stranglehold on any kind of diversification. So this mythology, of course, that coal has brought us a few jobs is so wrong, because we're living in an area that has had the highest unemployment, the highest poverty rates, and the worst health care factors than anywhere else in the country. Bob, our coal industry peaked in 1918. That's a century ago. And so for the next century, they've kept us on this chain of coal while they continue to plunder and take out billions of dollars while leaving people in ruins and no options, no alternatives but to leave the region. But what we want, I think now, is this concept of a just transition. We get 45% of our electricity from coal, and we know it's not going to end tomorrow, but we want to determine that we need to agree that we're going to commit somehow to a coal-free future. In order to get there, though, we need what we call a just transition, something like a GI Bill for coal miners, something that would provide massive reinvestment in clean energy jobs. We don't need to set up windmills. We can build windmills in our towns. We can build solar panels. I think there's a little bit of bewilderment right now in Illinois, is that why is the rest of the country plugging in and being part of this great clean energy boom, and those of us in the coal fields are being left behind? All we're getting is people like liberal Democrats like Dick Durbin, our great senator from Illinois, and even our president, who basically talk about the clean energy revolution, but then come back to us and say, and for you, another generation of coal.